Good afternoon and welcome to our program. My name is Dr. Jan Davidson. I'm the Cape Fear Museum's historian, and I'm delighted to be a part of this conversation about free people of color in North Carolina with Dr. Warren Milteer Jr. We are actually at capacity in terms of the numbers of folks who can sign in via Zoom. So we are recording this meeting and it will be posted on our Facebook page, but we're incredibly appreciative of everybody who signed on and the fact that there's such an interest in this topic. We also wanted to let you know if you have questions, we will have time for that at the end, and if you can post them in the chat box. We assume you know how to use Zoom, but if you put your wiggle your mouse and at the bottom there should be a chat feature. Please put your questions in the chat. We have a couple of Cape Fear Museum staff monitoring that, so they will be able to get us those questions going. So first, let me introduce our main person of the day. Warren Eugene Milteer Jr. is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina in Greensboro. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 2014. His publications include 2 academic books, Beyond Slavery's Shadow, Free People of Color in the South, which is forthcoming, and then North Carolina's Free People of Color, 1715 to 1885, which was published in 2020, and I have a copy of it right here. He's also published articles in the Journal of Social History and the North Carolina Historical Review. Before we start, we want to ask you to remain muted through the program. And as I said, one of our museum staff will be monitoring the chat for questions. So if you have things you'd like Dr. Milteer to talk about, please post those questions. And after I've asked him a couple of questions, we'll get to yours. So first, Warren, thank you so much for coming and being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I saw you on a chat a while ago and it was great. And we just thought it was a wonderful topic for us to just explore here at Cape Fear Museum. So first things first, can you give us an overview of the number of enslaved people and free people of color in North Carolina before the Civil War, just to give us a sense of the landscape of who you've studied?
Right. Yes. So about 1860, there were approximately 30,000 free people of color in North Carolina, and that's compared to about 330,000 enslaved people. And as far as the free people of color were concerned, they were spread across the state, but most of them were located either in the Piedmont or the eastern part of the state. So when you're thinking about portions of the state where there were large numbers of free people of color, we're thinking about Robeson County, Pasquotank, Hertford, Wake County, Granville County, Craven County, Halifax. Those were the areas in particular with large numbers of free people of color.
And do you know how many people, white people there were in 1860 as well? It's about 1 million, right? In the state's population, the whole is 1 million.
Yeah, I think the whole state's population is 1 million. So I guess that would leave us with about 600,000.
Okay. Okay, so what we're talking about is 2/3 white free people, 1/3, approximately about 1/3 of that enslaved, and then this small but important group of free people of color.
Right, exactly.
So in New Hanover County, we have more enslaved people and a larger number of free people of color proportionately than the state as a whole. You mentioned a few of the other areas that had a larger population. Do you have any thoughts about why some places had more free people of color than others?
So it seems that many of the areas that had large populations of free people of color were areas where there were significant settlements in the colonial period of free people of color. And so their numbers just grew over time, especially when we're thinking about areas like Robeson County, Hertford County. They had these long histories of good sized populations of free people of color. Also Craven to some extent, although I would also add that with places like Craven County, Halifax County, and this probably would even apply to New Hanover County as well, you did have significant number of manumissions of enslaved people in the late 1700s and early 1800s that helped to supplement and grow their populations.
So you just mentioned manumission and you talked about the colonial period. Can you walk us through the most common ways that people became free people of color in North Carolina?
Right. So, I mean, people either were born free or made free through this process of manumission. So, as far as being born free, if your mother was free when you were born, then you were automatically free. And as a result, there were many families who descended from white women who were free or Native American women who were free in the colonial period, and that's how they ended up with their liberty later on, all the way into the mid 1800s. Also, as far we're thinking about manumission, manumission could happen in a variety of different ways. So some people purchased themselves from the people who enslaved them. Other people would find another individual to buy them from the person who enslaved them. So it might be a free relative, it might be a friend, or somebody they negotiated with to purchase them on their behalfs. Also, you would have individuals who were freed because the person who owned them may have had some moral qualms with the issue of slavery, may have believed in, you know, certain parts of their religion dictated that they were not supposed to hold slaves. So that was particularly common amongst the Quakers. And so those were some of the main ways that people ended up free over time. And that's how you get 30,000 free people of color by the time we get to 1860.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you could become free through your mother. So obviously, having a free mother was was one of the main portions of the ways that people became this longstanding community. Was that always the case throughout the colonial period, that that enslavement sort of fell through the mother's line?
So, so as far as people gaining their freedom, it seems, although it's very difficult to quantify because we don't have, a census of North Carolina that details all the free people of color who lived here and where they came from. But it seems for the most part, based on circumstantial evidence, that the majority of free people of color in the colonial period gained their freedom because they were descendant of a free woman, either who was white or Native American. And also something else that plays a role in that is North Carolina law. So North Carolina's early manumission laws in the colonial period required those people who were manumitted to leave the colony. To what degree those laws were enforced is hard to figure out, but it seems for the most part that did have some impact in limiting the number of formerly enslaved people who were part of the population of free people of color in the colonial period. By the time we get into the revolution and the post-revolutionary period, the laws loosen up a little bit. And so you do have more manumissions, and as a result, more people who have close ties to enslaved people as far as being relatives, but in the 1800s.
That's really fascinating. So I read your book in preparation for this, and one of the things that I thought was really interesting was the ways that laws that affected free people of color changed over the 19th century, especially. We often think about history as being an improvement, like progress for things, but in the case of color, there's some stuff that happens in the 1830s. It seems like particularly that's really challenging. Could you talk a little bit about how that meaning of free people of color changes over time and what the ramifications were for those people who were in that category?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, over time, there's definitely a gradual deterioration of the legal status of free people of color in North Carolina and the South more broadly. In North Carolina, that diminishing status, however, does not seem to have been as the degree to which things changed were slower in North Carolina than it would have been, say, in something
Okay.
like Virginia. Um, and so when we're thinking about how did the different privileges that they lost over time, we're thinking about the loss of political privileges. So you mentioned the 1830s and 1835, free men of color lost the right to vote during a constitutional convention in that year. Um, we also see free people of color lose access to to being able to carry weapons freely. So they began to have to register guns and other weapons with their county courts. Some people followed those laws, some people did not, and the enforcement varied from place to place, but that was something that came about. Basically, what we're seeing over time is that the status of free people of color is being challenged by people who are becoming increasingly radical about the issue of slavery, and free people of color are thrown into that conversation about slavery. And what I argue is that it was difficult for politicians to actually make slavery any more harsh than it already was. And free people of color had certain rights, but in the colonial period, early 19th century, and it was easier to use them as a way to prove that you were making slavery more secure by attacking free people of color. And so as a result, all of these different laws that are passed, enslaved people's safety, meaning to keep them enslaved, is often cited as a reason to take away rights for free people of color. When you look at the background of some of these laws, however, the picture sometimes becomes a little bit more complicated than that. So for instance, I always use the example of restrictions on free people of color being able to sell liquor is a good example of this. So the people who were proposing restrictions on free people of color being able to sell liquor argue that it was about free people of color selling liquor to slaves. That was their excuse for taking away the right of free people of color to sell liquor. But then when you look at who was actually supporting the restrictions on liquor sales, it was white people who sold liquor. They were trying to create a monopoly for themselves. And you see that not just in North Carolina, but many other parts of the region as well. And so, there's this other side movement that's taking place beside this pro-slavery movement, and that's one of white supremacy. And there are people who are trying to create avenues for white people to do business and not have to have competition from people of color. And liquor is one area, and there are many others as well.
Yeah, I believe that they passed a law like that in Wilmington for New Hanover County. That definitely puts slavery and free people of color together and restricts their ability to assemble and to do some of them. And I think it does say to sell alcohol as well. That's a really fascinating take on why these laws happen. Is manumission gets harder as well, right? That it becomes increasingly hard to free somebody at the end of their life or your life as an enslaver. Do you think that is connected to the same kind of controlling slavery and then kind of controlling free people through the laws about enslavement as well?
Right. Yeah, I think that you can definitely make that argument that the people who are pro-slavery attack manumission because they see manumission as something that is damaging slavery and is a potential threat to slavery. If you think about what is going on in the nation more broadly, manumission is being used in the North, and it's being used to such a degree that slavery is either ended in certain states or is near its end by the time we get into the early parts of the 19th century. So there are, real life examples of how the expansion of freedom does threaten slavery. And I think these people are willing to, take away the rights of enslavers to free the people that they want to free in order to protect slavery more broadly.
Does that happen here in the 1830s when there's an increasing sense that there are people who are arguing that slavery is good for the folks that are enslaved, like they've gone from that necessary evil to positively promoting slavery. And if you free people, then you have these examples of people who are actually capable. So it kind of undermines that slavery is good for African Americans argument.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's when they're most successful as we get into the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. Although, interestingly, a lot of these ideas had popped up much earlier. And I think I'm thinking especially about limiting the political rights of free people of color. I mean, those debates are already taking place in the early 1800s, but it takes, 30 years to make it a reality. But the people who've been proposing this for a long time. And that's not really a surprise if we're thinking more broadly about what's going on in the South, where some of these restrictions that end up being passed in maybe the 1840s or 1850s against free people of color in North Carolina had actually been implemented in other states earlier.
So we talked a little bit about the places where there are lots of free people of color. In your book, I remember at least a couple of folks like the Sampsons who are from New Hanover County.
Right.
Would you mind talking, since we're at the Cape Fear Museums in New Hanover County, we have people from all over the place in the chat, but it would be really great if you could give a couple examples of folks who live here and their life, either before and after emancipation, if that's possible, but just in general to give us a better sense of who lived here.
Right. So you mentioned the Sampsons. I think they're probably one of the most notable examples of free people of color who were living in the 1800s in Wilmington. So that family was headed by James D. Sampson, who was a carpenter, and he had a large operation in Wilmington. He also was a slaveholder and also took in apprentices to work in his business. And the Sampson family, I think, is particularly notable not only because of their business success and James D. Sampson's success financially, but as far as thinking about what James D. Sampson particularly, was able to do with the financial resources that he gained. So some of his children actually were able to attend college, which was a rarity for anybody in the 1850s, in particular, a person of color. But what he had to do is he sent his children to the North in order to gain their more advanced education. So one of his sons attended Oberlin College in Ohio, which was a place that took in several free people of color from North Carolina for advanced education. Then he also had another son who attended school in Massachusetts. So yeah, the Sampson family is very fascinating, and they do play a role in North Carolina after the Civil War as well, as far as in educational efforts, political efforts in Wilmington.
Yeah, a couple of the sons are teachers, right?
Correct.
So, we haven't talked about the category or the definition of free people of color and how that changes. And I wondered if you could speak to that a little bit about the way Native Americans were included or excluded from that category and how that maybe complicates our understanding of race relations and racism or race in general in the South.
Right. Yeah, so the term or category free people of color encapsulated a variety of individuals with diverse backgrounds. And most of those people had some combination of either African and or Native American ancestry. And in the case of North Carolina in particular, most free people of color by the time we're getting to the 1860s were people of mixed ancestry. They had, a combination of different backgrounds, so maybe African, Native American, and European. And as far as the Native American ancestry of free people of color, the way that people determine whether somebody was a person of color or an Indian would have varied, but it seems clear that Native peoples who were not generally considered in their community as being part of a politically autonomous nation, such as the Cherokees, were considered people of color, whereas the Cherokees in Western North Carolina generally, especially living in their community, were recognized as Indians and not categorized as colored.
And is that simply a census designation, or does it have like broader ramifications for their political, social, or economic experiences?
So, it's actually has these broader implications. The problem is with North Carolina law, and this comes up a lot when we're talking about enforcement of the law, is that lawmakers were not very clear or often used a variety of different terms when creating laws. So how the laws were applied um, could be messy. And people
Mm-hmm.
often challenged enforcement of the laws because of the language that the laws contain. So, for instance, there are some laws that will mention specifically free people of color. Other laws will say free Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians. Sometimes they will say free Negroes, mulattoes, leave out the word Indian. Um, and it just varies from law to law what the actual text says. And so you will see lawsuits occasionally where individuals will claim, "Oh, well, I am a free person of color, but this law that you're trying to use against me says specifically that this law only applies to free mulattoes and free Negroes, and I'm not a free Negro or mulatto." Because I identify as Indian, or I have some other background that doesn't fit this particular definition of the law. And so sometimes the courts have to actually go back and try to clarify what do these terms mean. And the Supreme Court does that in the 1850s, and they do include both people of quote unquote Negro ancestry and people of Indian descent in their definition of free person of color. And that seems to be what most people in the state understood when it comes to that term.
So that was the state Supreme Court that made that decision in the
Yeah.
50s?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so you brought up the courts. Were there people who had to go in front of those courts and prove that to their community or the state that they were in fact free people of color? And how did they go about doing that?
Oh, well, yes, I mean, occasionally that did happen where the status of somebody would be uncertain. Part of the problem, this is usually something we see more in the colonial period in the early 19th century, is that there were these long periods of servitude where people could be indentured for a long period of time. And often people were indentured as children and may have not have been aware of their own status, or the people who had held them for so long that it wasn't clear amongst people in the larger community what their status was. And so these individuals, if they either knew they were supposed to be free or found out they were supposed to be free, they would go to the courts and sue for their freedom. And they would have to use the testimony of their neighbors in order to prove that they were free and not enslaved. So that's something that we see, especially, like I said, in the colonial period and early 19th century.
In 1860, in New Hanover County, there were more free women of color than there were free men of color, and many of them were laundresses or seamstresses or washerwomen, and a fair number of them had seemed to be women head of households. And
Right.
knowing that, I wondered if you saw that in other places. Were there more women who were free people of color than men? And if you could speak to any sort of gender issues that brings in people's experiences. Obviously, free women of color in 1820 couldn't vote like free men of color could, but are there other things that you see that complicates or illuminates the story of if you look at it through the prism of gender?
Right. Yeah. So I think overall in the state, there were slightly more free women of color than free men of color. And so you would have seen that pattern everywhere. As far as their experiences are concerned, you did mention the differences in political rights, but also issues around inheritance that was an issue for women. Parental rights. So women did not have the same parental rights under North Carolina law as men. So a child who had a mother, but either had no father as far as the father was dead, or if the father was, say, an enslaved person, that child would be considered an orphan under North Carolina law, and the courts had the right to take away that child and apprentice that child out. Whereas if you had a married couple and the father was alive and the mother was dead, um, that wouldn't be the same. The father would have parental rights to the child. So that's something we see that's really important um, in this time period, because a lot of free children of color, especially as we get further into the 19th century, are being apprenticed out, and often being apprenticed out by the courts without the full consent of their mothers. Some women try to take things into their own hands and push back against that. Sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. But yeah, they're not given the same consideration as a man would when it came to controlling the lives of his children and family.
Is that, did it affect their rights to own property? Because that sounds terrible, having a child and you being alive and then somebody else being able to control where they go. But I also know that women had less access to property rights in the 19th century in general as
Right,
well.
right, yes. And that would apply to free women of color as well, that they didn't have the same rights when they're married, in particular to property, as men would in those types of situations. Also, I should add that when we're thinking about opportunity and the ability to make money, jobs and access to certain types of jobs and certain types of work played an important role in creating discrepancies between men and women. So both in the apprenticeship system, but more broadly, men had greater opportunity to be trained in the variety of crafts, being carpenters, being blacksmiths, and those jobs in many cases allow them to accumulate wealth in a way that a woman could not, because she was restricted to being a seamstress or menial labor, things of that nature, where you just simply could not bring in and save enough money to become somebody like James D. Sampson. You know, James D. Sampson had this huge business in Wilmington. A woman would have struggled to do the same thing during that time period, especially in North Carolina.
Do you think that made it easier to free a woman of color than a man because there was less chance they could compete? Or is it just one of those things that demography somehow makes it that there are more women?
So I think in the case of North Carolina, it's really hard to tell. The gap is not that large between men and women. I think there's some communities where it's like 2/3 of the people are women and 1/3 are men. I don't see that more broadly in North Carolina. But as far as getting freedom is concerned, men have certain benefits if they have a trade. So there are some enslaved men who have trades and they're able to accumulate money very fast as a result of that. They buy their own freedom and then they're able to buy the freedom of their families. And that's more difficult for women to do. Women often have to depend more on their relationships with other people to do that same type of work. So that's where I think gender comes in as far as the manumission process.
So I've been seeing a lot of activity in the chat box, and I will be able to ask you some of those questions, or have us ask some of those questions. But I do have one last thing on my list, and what it was is, what do you think these stories that you've been telling us tell us about race in our state? And do you think knowing about free people of color's experiences changes how we see the past?
Sure. I think the case of free people of color, for one, makes us think about the significance of freedom, and it makes us ask, like, what is freedom and what is its relationship to race? And so in the case of free people of color, I bring this up more towards the end of my book, that freedom in many situations gave free people of color, or antebellum free people of color, a step up in the post-Civil War, the situation of the post-Civil War period, because many of them, because they had access to money, were able to educate their children. Even though the public schools did not allow free people of color generally to attend school, they could still hire tutors, or in the case of somebody like James Sampson, send their children out of state to receive an education. So that gave them a leg up. The fact that they were able to gain wealth and keep that wealth in much larger numbers than many enslaved people were able to do made a difference. Owning property. I mean, there are families today that own the property that their families obtained back in the antebellum period and before. And so they're still living off of that wealth now. That's a huge step up that many enslaved people did not have. And so, that does change the way that we think about how race works in the state, and the importance of freedom over time.
Thank you. I don't know if Amy or Barbie, you want to jump in and ask the questions, since I'm at the bottom of the chat box, but that would be awesome.
I'm happy to ask a few questions here, and we have a great group of people joining us today from all over, which is awesome. There's a question toward the beginning of the program. Were the Native and Indigenous individuals already removed by this time? Aren't there a lot of mixed free families?
I mean, so there are some people that are removed by the time we're getting to like the 1830s, but as I was trying to explain earlier, there are distinctions as far as Native people are concerned. So those people, like the Cherokees, there was a removal of Cherokees. All the Cherokees were not removed from North Carolina, by the way, but the removal of the Cherokees did not apply to people in the East, who were categorized as free people of color. So the impacts of those laws and acts from the federal government weren't the same. Also, there had been action taken, especially in the colonial period, to deal with many of the Eastern Native peoples, putting them on reservations, taking away their land, etc.
Another question from earlier in the conversation. How did they purchase themselves if they were slaves and typically they did not get paid? Or are you saying that some slave owners did pay their slaves?
So some slaveholders allowed the people they enslaved to work, and what those enslaved people would do is they would earn money and then give some percentage of that money to the person who held them as slaves. For some slaveholders, it was easier to do that than to actually be responsible for the day-to-day upkeep of an enslaved person, as far as feeding them, housing them. They let the enslaved person do that themselves, by working a trade. And it was an investment. If you trained an enslaved person to be an artisan, you could make potentially more money off of that person's working as an artisan than having a person work in the field doing common labor or something like that.
Another question, would you comment briefly on convict leasing in North Carolina? Where did it begin? How many free Blacks were ensnarled in this process?
So with convict leasing, when it began, I think, you could argue and debate about its origins, but I think that the story of free people of color definitely has something to tell us about convict leasing. There are processes taking place in the 19th century to, quote unquote, hire out free people of color for a variety of different crimes. So basically what happens is state lawmakers permit local courts to hire out free people of color who are unable to pay fines after being convicted of a variety of different crimes. And the state did not do a particularly good job at putting limitations on fines. So what you'll see is that some local court officials will assess an excessive fine with the goal of trying to have a free person of color hired out. And so this is being done on a much smaller scale in the pre-Civil War period than what we see after the Civil War. But I think it does tell us something about, what is to come in the Reconstruction period, Jim Crow period, by looking at the story of free people of color.
And I think you touched on this a bit already, but what were some of the other primary occupations of free people? I know you mentioned blacksmiths and carpenters, but I don't know if there were any other occupations that were prevalent.
I mean, they had occupations that spanned across the board. I mean, I think John Hope Franklin tried to tabulate this for either 1850 or 1860, and we're talking about hundreds of different occupations. In the mountains, you have free people of color who work as miners. On the coast, there are people who do shipping work, or mariners, fishermen. Of course, you have a lot of people working in agriculture as farmers, common laborers. In the cities, you might see free people of color working as butchers, cigar makers, shoemakers, you name it, they're doing it.
The next question is actually similar, but was there anything prohibited to free people of color, any particular profession?
As far as I can tell, you're not likely to see free people of color doing certain trades like goldsmithing. I don't think I've encountered that. There may be one somewhere in the South, but generally in a place like North Carolina, you wouldn't see them doing that type of work. They weren't explicitly prohibited, at least at the state level, from doing that kind of thing. But yeah.
There's also quite a few comments in the chat just asking about particular family names. We'll definitely make all that information available to you after the conversation. I'm going to maybe touch on just a couple here, and you may or may not have come across them, but one was asking about the Portis free people of color. Looks like they lived in Halifax, North Carolina, and migrated to Ohio.
Right. I mean, I don't have anything specific to say about that family, but there are a lot of free people of color who were living in North Carolina in the 1800s who end up relocating to places like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Some people go to Philadelphia and that region of the country as well, but especially areas like Ohio, Indiana, there are large numbers of free people of color there. I would even say in the late 1700s, some free people of color from North Carolina moved further south. They go to Tennessee, Alabama, Louisiana, places like that, with looking for opportunity. Those are the areas of the state, areas of the South where slavery was expanding, and by chance also there were greater opportunities to make money. And so some people go that direction, but they tend to go north, especially the further we get into the 19th century.
Another question asks, please speak of free people of color in the American Revolutionary War.
Yeah, so there are free people of color from North Carolina who serve in the American Revolution. Some of them are soldiers, others do other types of duty like guard duty, cooking, things of that nature. They're very much present during the war.
Kind of looking through some more of the comments, and can you explain more about how slaves were able to earn money on their own?
Yeah, so I think I gave some sense of that, but again, yeah, they were able to earn money because the people who enslaved them allowed them to work for themselves, and they would pay the person who enslaved them a certain percentage of their wages as compensation to the person who held them as slaves. And then some of them were able to save that money and then purchase their own freedom.
Well, lot of these are really asking, you know, more personal family questions. So like I said, we'll make those available to you afterward. But one, because you did touch on the Sampsons, do you have any other specific family stories maybe that you'd like to share about any particular families?
I mean, there's so many. I mean, anybody who's purchased my book can look through the index and see that I discuss a lot of families in North Carolina. I mean, we're talking about, 30,000 people. So to give you specific anecdotes, I would point people to the book if they want to learn more about those specific families.
Keep scrolling through. I'm going to see, Jan, is there anything else you wanted to mention that you see in the chat?
Barbie, I have a couple that I had tracked. And I know we're coming up on 45 minutes, and I don't want to exhaust anybody's attention span. But can you speak a little bit about how manumission was controlled by the courts and General Assembly during colonial period, after colonial period, and how that changed?
Yeah, so the General Assembly and the local courts played an important role in determining who could be manumitted, because North Carolina law required meritorious service in order for a person to be free. And so it was often up to the courts and the General Assembly to decide what meritorious service was. And it could be a variety of different things. Some people gained their freedom based on meritorious service because maybe they served in the American Revolution. But then it could be something as simple as the individual was a faithful servant. That's what a person petitioning on their behalf for freedom might have claimed, that they were a faithful servant, and that was good enough in some courts to be manumitted. In other places, it wouldn't have been. It was done on a case-by-case basis. And I think there's certain time periods for certain counties where there's a greater opportunity to gain freedom through manumission than in others.
We have another series of questions related to religion. To what degree were free people of color organizing their own churches and religious organizations? And a separate question from, I believe, somebody else, I may have missed that, but can we address the prohibition against preaching after 1830? So I don't know how related those are or not.
Right. So as far as organizing their own churches, it's not as common in North Carolina as you might see, say, in somewhere like Maryland or Washington, D.C. during the same period in the 19th century. But there are a few churches organized by free people of color. And most of these churches are headed by white ministers, because I think what's being implied in the other question that you asked about is that there are restrictions placed on people of color being able to serve as ministers in the 1830s. And so congregations of free people of color therefore needed to employ, at least officially, white ministers to serve as the heads of their churches. And often these ministers also represented these churches in the larger religious bodies, and Baptist meetings and things of that nature.
We still have a flood of questions coming in, and trying to keep up with them. Dr. Milteer, are you okay for another question or two?
Sure.
Jan, how are you doing? I don't know if you want to comment on any of these as well. Real quickly, I don't think we're going to get to quite all of them, but can you speak on being enslaved or re-enslavement of free Blacks?
Yeah, so re-enslavement, there are a couple of instances that pop up, especially when we're thinking about the 1850s. I think this is where we're going. I can address this in two different ways. In the 1850s, where there are few free people of color who petition to be enslaved, and they're doing this generally in order to avoid being kicked out of the state because state law requires that people who are manumitted in the later period leave North Carolina. So they're doing that. But what happens in North Carolina, unlike some other southern states, is the General Assembly comes to the conclusion this is not legal and it's unconstitutional to make a free person enslaved. In Virginia, you can do that, but in North Carolina, you're not able to actually become a slave as a free person. And another way to look at this question too, I'm not sure which is the person is getting at, but there's kidnapping, and so that's a problem for free people of color in North Carolina and other parts of the South as well. Well, it actually extends beyond the South. So free people of color are being kidnapped and sold into slavery far away from wherever they are originally from. So you might kidnap somebody in North Carolina and then sell them to Alabama. And there are these gangs of people, as well as just certain individuals, who go about kidnapping free people of color and then shipping them to other parts of the country.
We have not had a chance to quite get to all of our questions, but maybe we can share those with you, and you know, if there are some answers that we can share out in some other way, maybe we will try to do that. But I do want to just say thank you so much, and I'll let Jan, if you have any final questions or any final conversation that you would like to talk to Dr. Milteer about. I'll just offer my own thanks. This was an incredible conversation. I've really enjoyed it, and thanks to our audience. There has just been such a vibrant chat going on that I don't know that you and Jan have had a chance to see, but people talking about personal stories, who and where they're descended from. We have people from all over the country who've joined us. It really is amazing, and thank you so much for coming and participating. And Jan and Dr. Milteer, I'll let you guys wrap it up.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think this has been really great. There was somebody who brought up pirates and whether there were free people of color descended from pirates. For the most part in Wilmington, in this area, the pirates were here before the settlement was. So that's, I think maybe Dr. Milteer knows more. I think that's a little unlikely. What we do know is that as David Soselsky puts it so fantastically, slavery frays at the water's edge. There are opportunities to escape. There are opportunities to learn skills that then give you a livelihood. And I definitely know that there were free people of color who were pilots and watermen and fishermen in our region, and who used those skills. And like, I think one of the things that I appreciated about what Dr. Milteer said was about how this gives you a leg up after emancipation, that you've started with this basis. And we see that very clearly in Wilmington and New Hanover County with families like the Howes, all these people who had free builders and carpenters, and they then go on to become the educators and the elected officials of the Reconstruction era. So for me, those are the things that as Warren started talking in more richness and texture that came up. And I don't know if, so again, I want to thank you also for being here, Warren, and give you the last word, and then we'll say goodbye.
Well, thank you all for this opportunity. I enjoyed speaking with you all. And for those people who haven't, check out my book and see what you find it might interest you. Thanks, everybody.
So thank you, and we will post this to our Facebook page, I believe, so that folks, if you know folks who didn't get a chance to join in, there was a limit on the number of people who could sign in, then please let them know. And thank you so much for spending your Friday lunchtime with us here at the Cape Fear Museum, or wherever you are, but with us virtually here at the Cape Fear Museum.